One of the most influential interpretations of Mansfield Park was offered by the critic and political theorist Edward Said in his book Culture and Imperialism from 1993. There, Said looks at several familiar canonical novels and thinks about how they might be linked with the idea of imperialism. He suggests that great works of literature don't exist in isolation, but they might, perhaps indirectly, be the products of the ideology or the material reality of empire. But he also suggests that such works are striving to hide or conceal their connections to this context, to Britain's global dominance in the 19th century. Here's what he says about Mansfield Park. In order more accurately to read works like Mansfield Park, we have to see them in the main as resisting or avoiding that other setting which their formal inclusiveness, historical honesty, and prophetic suggestiveness cannot hide. In time, there would no longer be a dead silence when slavery was spoken of. Well, this is clearly a fascinating view. On the one hand, Said is suggesting that Mansfield Park, and any novel like it, must somehow hide or conceal the gruesome facts of empire. It resists or avoids the other setting of Antigua. And yet Said seems to be suggesting that the novel's aesthetic prowess, its realism, I think he means, its historical honesty, means that the novel cannot but help end up revealing that which it attempts to conceal. Well, this leads us to an awkward position. Is it really possible that Austen almost accidentally allows some sort of concealed guilt about slavery to leak into her novel, only to silence it quickly when it happens? Said's implication is that the dead silence results from an inability to reconcile the world of Mansfield Park and the world of Antigua. Indeed, Said goes on to suggest that it would be silly to expect Austen to be politically engaged in the way some other groups would be. That's actually what he says. It would be silly to expect Jane Austen to treat slavery with anything like the passion of an abolitionist or a newly liberated slave. But why? Why would it be so silly? Other writers, women writers like Austen, did write in support of the abolition of slavery. Austen's work, I want to argue, can be linked with these other writings. And if we do that, we can begin to find the novel speaking to us in unexpected ways. Ways that mean that the novel is always breaking the silence that Said insists it tries so hard to maintain. The example of this that I want to focus on doesn't concern Sir Thomas Bertram, but rather his wife, Lady Bertram. What I'm really interested in is the significance of what might seem like a minor or a comic detail, and that is her languorous motions, her laziness, her almost sleepiness. I'll read out a brief passage. Lady Bertram, sunk back in the corner of the sofa, the picture of health, wealth, ease and tranquillity, was just falling into a gentle doze, while Fanny was getting through the few difficulties of her work for her. This might seem to us to be a comic picture. Lady Bertram, who cares more about her dog than about people, is often seen in these soporific states, falling asleep while others are busy around her. Film versions of the novel are particularly keen to exploit the comic potential of this character. And she is comic. But if we begin to build in some context around her, we can see that Austen is drawing upon a character type, one which would have been familiar to her audience, but that is less familiar to us today. Here are a few lines from a poem by one of Austen's contemporaries, the writer Anna Letitia Barbauld. The poem they're taken from is called Epistle to William Wilberforce, Esquire, on the rejection of the bill for abolishing the slave trade. The poem is from 1791, so a little earlier than Mansfield Park. Its title explains what the poem is doing. It's written to William Wilberforce, who was an MP who led calls for the abolition of the slave trade in Britain. And Barbauld wrote the poem after Parliament had rejected a bill for abolishing the slave trade. And in it, we see Barbauld imagining a woman presumably in the West Indies, who lives in comfort, supported by slaves. This is how it goes. Lo, where reclined, pale beauty courts the breeze, diffused on sofas of voluptuous ease. With anxious awe, her menial train around catch her faint whispers of half-uttered sound. Like Lady Bertram, this woman, who's personified here as pale beauty, seems to do very little other than lounge on sofas, taking pleasure in a kind of extreme luxury. However, the image of indolent femininity is clearly politicised in this poem. This lady's luxurious lifestyle is visibly enabled and supported by slave labour, her menial train who tiptoe around her. Something similar occurs in the writing of another of Austen's contemporaries, Maria Edgeworth, whose tale, The Grateful Negro, from 1804, features another similar character. Now, this story is set in Jamaica, and it features a plantation owner called Mr. Jeffries. And the description I'm interested in is of his wife. I'll read it out. Mrs. Jeffries was a languid beauty, or rather a languid fine lady who had been a beauty, and who spent all that part of the day which was not devoted to the pleasures of the table or to reclining on the couch in dress. She was one day extended on a sofa, fanned by 4 slaves, 2 at her head and 2 at her feet, when news was brought that a large chest directed to her was just arrived from London. Again, the image we're presented with is of a leisured female body, one that's made feeble as a result of its devotion to a life of pleasure. There's nothing firm or stable about such a character. All of these characters, Mrs. Jeffries, Pale Beauty, and Lady Bertram, are presented as if they melt into their surroundings. All 3 of them, significantly I'd suggest, also sit on sofas or couches. These women are described as reclining, or Lady Bertram is sunk onto her sofa. There's a recurring set of imagery around this figure that helps descriptions of this kind to crystallise into a type, the languid plantation owner's wife. This is a character type that was familiar to Austen's audience and very much in the culture of that time. So considering this, when Lady Bertram is described as the picture of health, wealth, ease and tranquility, we should begin to make connections between her position of comfort and the source of her wealth and ease, Sir Thomas's plantation in Antigua. Thinking of Edgeworth's Mrs. Jeffries, who has slaves fanning her as she relaxes, we might also think about Fanny Price's status in Mansfield Park. In the passage I've just quoted, it's Fanny, rather than an African slave, who busies herself while her indolent mistress drifts in and out of consciousness. She's the one getting through the difficulties of her work. Some critics have even suggested that Fanny Price can be considered as a kind of slave herself. Like a slave, she's been transplanted from her native home in Portsmouth to the estate of a powerful man, Sir Thomas Bertram. Only she's been transported to his estate at Mansfield Park rather than his plantation in Antigua. I think it's up to you how far you would want to take this reading. But what this one example shows is that slavery is everywhere in Mansfield Park, just beneath the surface of the novel, waiting for us to identify it. And the way that we're able to do that is by locating Austen's novel within a broader network of similar text, to the point that even a tiny detail, like the fact that Lady Bertram lies on a sofa, can help us to think about the way in which Austen's novel employs a shared discourse or language of slavery. In this respect, and in conclusion, I'd ask you to consider this comment from the critic Claudia Johnson. She says, "The novels of Jane Austen focus on the discourse rather than the representation of politics." This is a complex idea, but Johnson's suggesting that while Austen doesn't directly represent political events, her works are nevertheless politically charged. Austen's works, she says, tap into a broader language or discourse of politics, which probes ideological questions without resorting to polemical posturing. And by that I mean Austen's work doesn't try to force an agenda upon us, but it does engage with the politics of the time. Acknowledging this doesn't mean that we can't continue to take pleasure in Austen's novels, or that we have to stop enjoying them. It just means that we gain a greater appreciation of the sheer range of her writing. The indirect but unmistakable engagement with slavery and empire in Mansfield Park reminds us that silence in Austen's writing is not necessarily an absence, but rather the submerged presence of something that we, as modern readers, can uncover via a process of careful, historically sensitive reading. Thank you.